So today we've got a discussion I think will be very interesting. We've got some great panelists on a topic that is very relevant. If any of you have seen what's been happening in Washington, maybe as of yesterday, we are going to be talking about federal transparency of funds, particularly direct federal funds that go to state subdivisions and how that impacts Texas, how that impacts federalism. And we'll be talking heavily about debt and what that means for all of us in this room, for our kids, our grandkids, and moving forward. And I think we'll have a lot of really interesting commentary from three very unique perspectives as well. So just as a reminder, please turn off your cell phones if you haven't already. And for anybody needing to fill out your continuing legal education, the CLE forms, I believe, are in the back on that table if you need to sign in. So make sure you stop by there if you need to do that. So I'm just going to explain how this panel is going to work. I'm going to introduce each of our panelists. It's going to be a very free-flowing conversation type panel. It should be very organic. We're going to talk for about 45 minutes. We're going to open it up to you guys for questions. Feel free to ask any question that you think is relevant with regard to federal debt, local debt, federalism in general, and we'll just have some fun. I think that's probably the best way to do this. There's so much to talk about when it comes to the federal government and its impact on Texans. And my job every day is basically to say no to the federal government on everything. That's my default setting. I do not get off that setting, and if I do, please call a doctor. I probably hit my head and need to be seen immediately. So without any further ado, I will introduce our panelists, and then we will get started. So immediately to my left is Representative Matt Krause. Many of you probably know him in the room. He's a constitutional attorney, a college professor of American history and government, and a public speaker on America's founding fathers. In his third term in the Texas State Legislature, and this 85th session, he served on 2 House committees, the Culture, Recreation, and Tourism Committee and the Land and Resource Management Committee. During his time in the House of Representatives, he's been recognized for his stances on limited government, fiscal responsibility, traditional family values, and pro-life advocacy, and is a great friend of the foundation, and we're very privileged to have him here today. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next to him is Abby Livingston. She is the Washington Bureau Chief of the Texas Tribune, which she has been a part of since 2014. In this role, she won the 2017 National Press Club Award for Washington Regional Reporting. She previously covered political campaigns, House leadership, and Congress for Roll Call magazine, which is the Capitol Hill newspaper. I'm very familiar with it, so it's awesome. She has pitched and produced political segments for CNN and worked as an editor for The Hotline, National Journal's campaign tip sheet. And she began her journalism career as a desk assistant at NBC News in Washington, working her way up to the political unit where she researched stories for Nightly News, The Today Show, and Meet the Press. So, Abby, we are very happy to have you here as well.
Thank you.
And last but certainly not least is Derek Monson. Derek is a staffer at the Sutherland Institute, where he began as a policy analyst in 2007. He now oversees Sutherland's strategic policy and legislative initiatives and is their key authority on all things federal related. He has influenced a variety of public policy issues in Utah, including economic development and regulation, tax and budget, government transparency, which we'll be talking a lot about today, public education, religious freedom, Medicaid reform, alcohol regulation, and immigration policy. His research has been published in public budgeting and finance and has provided expert policy analysis and commentary for the LA Times, the Washington Examiner, the Associated Press, the Federalists, and the Utah State Legislature. Derek, thanks for joining us today. So I'm just going to jump right into it and give everybody kind of an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. In 2015, there was a report that came out from the Texas Bond Bureau, which basically showed that local debt in Texas from municipalities and the subdivisions was at $340 billion. When that report came out, the Texas Public Policy Foundation obviously reacted in a very alarming way, and we put out a paper on transparency. The need to know exactly how much money is flowing from Washington, D.C. and circumventing the state legislature and going directly to these subdivisions, directly to these municipalities. And the reason we felt this was important is because if we look around, we look at what's going on in Washington, D.C., we're now at $21 trillion in debt. And the spending increases, fortunately, regardless of who's in power, have not stopped. They're continuing to bust the budget caps. They're continuing to spend more money regardless of who's in control of Congress. And eventually, there's going to be a contraction in federal funds. Eventually, Washington, D.C. is not going to be able to pay that tab. And Texas is going to be left to pay our share of this. And so when you look at the total municipal debt, when you look at what these subdivisions owe, we felt like it was very important to figure out exactly how much money Washington's just circumventing the state legislature so that we know how much we're on the hook for in addition to the federal debt that's sort of crushing us. So we've been promoting a transparency initiative. It's going to be a big part of our legislative agenda in the next session. And this is something that's a relatively new issue in the sense that a lot of people aren't talking about it. And we want to actually use this session today to sort of open this up as part of a public education campaign on why this is a problem and also some potential remedies for it. So I'm going to go ahead and move to our first question. And this is for all you guys. We want it to be very open-ended. We want you guys to have a good discussion. So feel free to key off each other, answer each other's questions. I think that's probably the best way to do this. So in regard to this 2015 report by the Texas Bond Review Board, which showed this massive amount of debt, $330 billion. It's gone down since then, fortunately. It's now at about $220 billion, but that's still a lot of money. Should this be alarming to Texans? Why should it be alarming, and what should we do about it? Start with you, Representative Krause.
Sure, yeah, I absolutely think it should be alarming, and I think that's the part that you never talk about, right? We all know about the federal deficit. We all know that it's out there, and we want to get that under control. Texas is mandated to have a balanced budget, and so we always have to do that. So I think people think, well, federal government may not be doing well, but the state's doing fine. Well, that doesn't include the local governments, and so that's where our big indebtedness is. Now, honestly, I think the state legislature has to take some responsibility for that because we have unfunded mandates often. And so we say, hey, you local governments, you have to do this or we have to do these programs, but we don't give you the money to pay for them. And so honestly, I think that's one of our weaknesses, and I would like to see the legislature look into that and make sure we're not giving those unfunded mandates to the local governments. But having said that, I think that's where you're seeing all the growth and increase. And so I think it's incumbent on each and every one of us to be engaged, to be informed on what's going on in our local communities and governments. And when a bond issue goes up, is it worth it? Is it justified? Is this what we need? Is this not what we need? And I think that's where we have to be asking the question. So yeah, I think it is a big deal. I think it is a very important deal. And even if the state and the federal government are doing well, but your local governments can't sustain themselves, it's going to have a ripple effect throughout the entire structure of government going forward.
I actually attended a seminar last spring about local debt, specifically bonds and pensions. And I am not a great math person, and I don't really understand accounting, but it was very accounting
Neither
heavy.
is anyone in Washington, D.C., so you're okay.
There you go.
That's right.
But I got the gist of it, and it was really terrifying. And it was a national look. And it was just really amazing to me how for so many decades, politicians have had unrealistic projections of investments they've made with pension funds and things like that. And kind of the recurring bad children in this seminar, I think, were New Jersey, Illinois, and Dallas. And it was just all around blew my mind. And I typically deal with the federal government, but one of the gentlemen speaking to us actually had to deal with the debt crisis in New York City in the 70s, and it was just like, oh my gosh. And so it feels like something nobody cares about, nobody's taking seriously, but it's coming eventually. And on top of that, we have all of our debt in the federal government. So, and I'm weirdly passionate about this issue. I've been that way since I was 18, and we'll probably circle back to it, but there aren't that many people in Washington who care about the debt. The world has kind of, I feel like in the 90s, people did care about it, but there are so many other issues going on in the world now that it is just a peripheral issue on the federal level.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what's been said. I'll just add a few points to emphasize. So I'm not entirely certain, obviously working in Utah, focusing on Utah, how Texas is structured, but in Utah, there are certain subdivisions of the state that the state has either a direct, like a guarantee on their bond, on their debts, or they have what's considered a moral obligation, that if the political subdivision doesn't come through, while there's no legal obligation for the state to step in, it's kind of expected that's what's going to happen, and that's how rating agencies look at it. And so when you have that much debt on a political subdivision level, if any of those things are at play in Texas, that should cause some alarm for some folks, because it's kind of hidden debt that you don't even understand that you're going to have to pay for at a state level. And then secondly, I think I would just say that you know, the tough thing about the debt is that it oftentimes can be manipulated, particularly at a local level. Things get thrown in there that maybe, you know, when you take a look at it reasonably, maybe not a long-term obligation, maybe it's not a capital expenditure that you typically finance with debt, but there's a big project that's nice and shiny and glittery. It's going to get a lot of public support, so let's cram that debt obligation full of any amount of stuff that we'd rather not spend on budget. So it's another need for transparency, again, at the local level, so that, you know, if that's what the cities, counties, or school districts are going to do, then that's fine, as long as the voters can see and understand that, and it's not being hidden from them.
So Dr. Lindsay, who wrote our paper on this, and he runs kind of our higher education center, but he also does a lot of work, obviously, in this area. He argues that not only is this a potential looming fiscal crisis for all of us, but that it poses a direct threat to federalism. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Derek, I'll go back to one thing that you said during this last session, the 85th session. We actually had to debate on the House and Senate floors what we were going to do with the Dallas pension system and the Houston pension system for the firefighters. And so as you were saying, you know, it's not just localities that have to worry about that. Sometimes it broadens into a whole state issue. Sometimes you argue about local control, and sometimes you say, yeah, we'd love for you to have local control until it bubbles up till we have to address it. But yeah, I do agree that it's a huge issue. And because the more we're in debt, the more we have to rely on the federal government to bail us out in theory, right? And as Abby's already said, the federal government doesn't really have that money. But the more debt we have at a local and state level, and we've already seen it with some other states asking the federal government to bail them out or to help them or to shore up some of their expenses, then I absolutely think it's a big thing. And Texas always talks about federalism, and we're the Republic of Texas, and we're our own country, and you know, we want to be our own people and define our own way of life, yet we take hundreds of millions of dollars from the federal government. Anytime you take that kind of money, there's strings attached to it. So the more we can not rely on the federal government, the more we can have our own fiscal house in order, the better we are to stand and say, no, this is where we're going to be autonomous, this is where we want to stand, and the policies that we want to pursue.
So after I read the paper, the TPPF paper, I sort of viewed my role as maybe to pick the brains of Democrats and play a little devil's advocate. And I can't say the folks I spoke to were terribly riled up on this issue, and it was very incendiary to them. I mean, they were just, one of their concerns was, apparently this is something that is said in the federal grant world, the only thing worse than applying for a federal grant is getting a federal grant. The red tape is just so hard, and the paperwork. And so what sort of the counter to some of this was, if you bring in the state to regulate between the federal government and the local municipalities, it's just another layer of bureaucracy to deal with. And the other point they made was, in the grand scheme, this is not a large amount of money going to local municipalities in the state. And so, you know, it was just sort of an interesting, you know, I'm used to just every issue I deal with, everyone just explodes in anger on both sides, and they were pretty mellow about it. So I thought that was an interesting view.
Yeah, well, it definitely, I think, has the capacity to undermine federalism, and I think it also tends to push a certain view of what federalism should be. So, for example, oftentimes, right, federal grants going directly to cities or school districts or wherever have maintenance of effort requirements, or will require the city or the school district to hire more employees to administer the grant program. And sometimes it even goes as far as that the policies that are being connected to the federal grant, some of them wouldn't otherwise be put in place by the city or the school district, but there's some that they like, and they're willing to accept the policies they don't like to get the money. And when you think about that, that's not how our federal system was intended to work, right? The system or the government level of government with all the money, using its money to manipulate what policies everyone else makes. and then putting them on the hook to grow the size of their governments to maintain those things. And so, yeah, it's really kind of an insidious thing, or it can be, and it requires a lot of diligence among the public to kind of understand what's going on and what you can do about it.
Yeah. I want to pick up on something I think Representative Krause, you may be able to speak to, and just federalism in general. I mean, when you talk about it, when it's talked about, do you think people understand the concept, or has that kind of been lost a little bit?
No, yeah, I think it's been very lost. Just the idea that our founding fathers have of that federalist system. The federal government had its own purposes, and that's what I always talk about with people. They say, you know, you want to get Washington, D.C. out of your life in Austin, yet Austin wants to get involved in more things at the local level. And there's two different relationships there, right? Because the federal government and the Constitution is a document of enumerated powers. So anything listed in it is the purview of the federal government. Anything not listed in it should not be done by the federal government. The Texas Constitution doesn't have the same parameters. They've got a lot more leeway, a lot more ability and flexibility to speak into different areas. And so people don't understand that. They just lump it all together. And then on the federalism side, Derek, as you said, I think we've kind of distorted our view of federalism. There was a Supreme Court case, United States versus Prince, and the Supreme Court held that the federal government cannot compel the states to enforce its laws, which sounds like a very federalist thing to do. But then they added, yeah, but you can incentivize them. You can give a carrot or a stick in terms of funding to make them do what you want them to do. And I wish they would have stopped at the first part. You know, the states they're autonomous beings, that you can't compel them to do things without giving them that, unless you can do this or figure out a way to do this. To me, that's kind of where this all kind of got distorted. And now they do use the purse strings to kind of figure out what states can and cannot do. Instead of being laboratories of experiment, we're all under the federal umbrella now, and I think that's made things a lot worse.
Yeah. Abby, you have anything on that?
No, I mean, the main thing I would say, and I'm looking at this from the Washington, D.C. vantage point, where I just walk the halls of Congress, and if Democrats take back control of the House, which is a real possibility, I think we could see earmarks coming back, and that's going to be a very interesting thing to add to this conversation. And there's sort of clearly a lot of conservatives don't like them, but it could help this will drive you crazy, whipping the votes and not having they can have leverage over individual members to get them in line. So that's sort of the argument for earmarks. And it can be a really interesting debate. And on top of that, it's sort of a cruel reality for Kay Granger. She is now running for chairwoman of appropriations, which is where the earmarks come through and they handle spending. But if Democrats take over, she would not be chairwoman, she'd be the ranking member. So Texans would actually have a very powerful person in the spending process, but she may not be in the majority. So that's the main kind of Washington vantage I can give on some of this.
Yeah, actually, I don't really have anything to add on that.
So I'm curious, Abby, you said something that was really interesting. You said when you talk with Democrats, they didn't light their hair on fire, which is unusual, I think, in this climate, in this environment. Everything seems to be very hyperbolic, hyper-partisan. Is this an issue, transparency, maybe not at the Washington level, maybe here in Texas, transparency of these funds and flowing to these municipalities? Is that something, do we think that could be a bipartisan issue?
I don't know. My sense was they just hadn't thought about it that much. And so there was more kind of just thinking out loud. And so maybe, I don't know. I mean, as a journalist, I'm always going to want that. I think it'd be great to have total clarity on that. It helps us do our job and it helps us inform the public. So, I don't know. Maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's an opportunity for bipartisanship. As you said, transparency is a big one of those buzzwords that it seems like everybody gets behind or has the potential to get behind. And so I've had a bill the last couple of sessions which just said, hey, the state government needs to know where these local governments are getting their money from. And depending on what you do with that money and depending on how that's done, that could help us budget appropriately. That could help us prioritize in ways that we need to do that. And I think that's something that could get bipartisan approach. As Abby said, if you try to use that maybe to push back against local governments or to punish them in some way for getting federal funds, that's where you could see some of that maybe partisan pushback. But overall, I think transparency is one of those goals for all of us.
Yeah, I think just as an example of that. So in Utah, we passed a series of laws that have kind of been lumped together under the banner of Financial Ready Utah. And interestingly enough, it kind of started with our local CPA association, local chapter of CPAs. And they were very concerned, as well as the national group, the AICPA has been very concerned about federal debt and funding obligations that are not being reported or discussed out there. That, the 21 trillion actually very greatly underestimates the spending obligations that are out there, as an example. And so we passed this series of laws, one of which is maybe more pertinent to this discussion, that required cities as well as state agencies to report all the federal funding that they're getting, in detail, what it's for and how they're using it. But then required them to create a contingency plan for a 5% and a 25% cut to the federal funds that they receive. And they have to post this on their website. And they have to, if it's a state agency, they report to various committees that oversee them. If it's a city, the city manager, for example, bring it to the city council. And so the point of all this was, again, to maintain that transparency and to think through and to force folks to think through this issue that the federal financial obligations are unsustainable. So we need to be ready whenever that hits, and that bill comes due, to how are we going to deal with that. And so that was a very bipartisan policy push. There were folks that had real questions, right? Is this like the first step towards just going and cutting federal funding and refusing these programs and this and that? But it became pretty clear, particularly when it was coming from accountants, CPAs, that this is just about the numbers. This is just about making sure people understand what's going on. And then again, making preparations for, once we understand what's going on, that it's unsustainable, making preparations for the reality that we're going to have to deal with at some point.
Yeah. And about that reality too, obviously we haven't gotten there yet, but if we continue on this trajectory, we continue to spend money that we don't have, and like you said, we talk about a $21 trillion debt, but if you look at unfunded liabilities, it's actually close to $100 trillion, and that's just money that you can't even fathom those numbers. That's numbers that it's almost funny math, it's almost made up at this point. And it would be comical if the consequences, right, weren't so dire. And I guess I'd like for y'all to elucidate a little bit on, Texas we like to brag about the Texas prosperity model. We like to brag about our relatively low taxes, relatively low regulation, relatively low spending in comparison to other states, and our booming economy, and it's something we're very proud of. When Washington, D.C. continues along this path and they can't pay the bills, what does that look like for Texans or Utahns or just Americans in general?
Yeah, another great question. And I've actually had a bill, all 3 sessions that I've been in, which would establish a fiscal risk management commission. And that would look at any kind of event that might happen that could be catastrophic for us on a lot of different levels: cybersecurity, grid security, monetary policies. And so you're right, I think we have to be forward thinking about that, because once it hits, it's too late to go back and say, okay, what could have we done better? But so I think hopefully, and we're going to push it again next session, if we could institute some of that fiscal risk management commission, be forward thinking, what happens if this happens? Almost to your model, what happens if we lose 5%, 25%, the entire dollar falls down, Bitcoin takes over and nobody knows how to use it, So whatever it is, whatever the contingency would be, I think we need to look at that. So I think we do need to be proactive and forward looking, and hopefully next session we'll start doing that.
I'll just kind of give y'all a window into my afternoon yesterday. So I wrote a story about the Senate getting the deal on spending, or the budget deal. And in my story, as the Texas reporter, mine is going to be different from everyone else's, because I'm going to lead with Hurricane Harvey relief. And it was, fairly good news for Houston. The House wanted $80 billion, and the Senate is now wanting $90 billion. So that's good for Houston. So I lead with that, and then I work through my story, and I start talking about all the different things. Pelosi set her record in the House yesterday, and I get through it, and then I'm like, sort of as almost a throwaway, and oh, by the way, this is also going to increase the debt. And that's not because I don't care, it's just of all the things that happened, that was the lowest on the newsworthy of atmospherics going on. And it was hardly a point of debate. There were so many other pieces, the DACA, that were points in the negotiation. And it's a fascinating thing to watch. And I don't think my life and my lifestyle has been affected as the deficit has increased. But at some point, I mean, I will confess to y'all, I got a C in economics in high school, but at some point, if you want to apply for a mortgage, the interest rates are going to go up, and the average American is going to start feeling the effects of this. And but right now, it's just an abstraction that the average American doesn't think about, and if they're not thinking about it, their elected officials are not going to, be raising Cain on the floor about it. I mean, some of them do, but not enough to really create some changes in policy.
Again, your C is higher than almost everyone in Congress.
Yeah,
right now, I give them an F grade, so they should
that's
listen
right.
to you if you made a C.
Yeah.
I don't want to oversell anything.
Yeah, I think we have a few examples that give us a glimpse of what this new world, I guess you want to call it that, is going to look like. Sequestration is a great example, right? When, due to budget concerns, debt concerns, we enforce spending caps that require cuts to federal funds, particularly federal funds going to states and local governments. And I don't know what that looked like here in Texas, but in Utah, that was a sobering moment for a lot of people. And in some of these real world ways that have been addressed, cuts to school nutrition programs, for example, or things that everyday people experience, benefit from, and it forced a lot of tough conversations, and it was healthy, I think, because this was just a little minor. I mean, it wasn't that big of a cut, if we're being candid, right? Certainly not in the context of all of the debt that's there and the unfunded obligations. But there's going to be more of those kinds of situations. Just think, for example, the growing interest that we have to pay on our federal debt. Now, right now, that hasn't been such a big deal because the Fed has kept interest rates very low, but that's not going to last forever. And as more of federal funds go to pay interest, that squeezes out some of these other programs. So you're going to have a national level, what the states had to deal with sequestration. What are we going to cut? Or are we just going to raise taxes? Yeah. And neither of those are great options. But that's really, unless we're very forward-thinking at a state and local level, making plans for, okay, here's how we're going to maybe hold back right now, set aside some funds. I'll give you a couple more examples in Utah of what we're trying to do. In our budget reserve accounts, rainy day funds, we've introduced some parts to the formula that take account for what's the likelihood of federal funding cuts. And so the amount getting deposited there is now going to vary depending on how high they term that risk. We also have something very similar to what you described of a risk model, a risk planning model. And if states and cities and counties and school districts aren't doing that kind of thing right now, then they will simply have to cut programs or raise taxes. That will be their only options. And you'll probably have to do that anyway, even with some of these things that like in Utah and you want to push here in Texas. But it'll be a lot easier to adjust to if you start thinking about it, planning and acting today, rather than waiting until the next sequestration or the interest gets too big or default happens or whatever the crazy scenario is going to be.
I mean, obviously everybody in this room cares to some degree about what's going on and cares about this. We're talking about the enormity of the debt. We're talking about the shocking amount of debt that our local municipalities have here in Texas. How do we, from your particular vantage points, how do you change that conversation? How do you get people to be more concerned about where this will eventually lead? And, what sort of policy solutions, have y'all thought through maybe in the state legislature in Utah that kind of go beyond just tracking what's happening or transparency of funds? Like, what's the aggressive approach that we should be thinking about?
Yeah, in terms of what you can do about it, I just watched everything going on yesterday, and the line that kept coming back to me is when Shakespeare, he said, "It's full of sound and fury, yet signifying nothing." And that's what I felt like Republicans did for the 8 years during the Obama administration, right? When we talked about the debt, we talked about debt ceilings, we talked about continuing resolutions. We had to get this under control, had to get it under control. All of a sudden they get into power And okay, now the debt's not so bad as long as we're spending it on the things that we want to spend it on, right? And that's just been the most disheartening, frustrating thing for me. And so what do you do about it? You have to elect the right people to office. I know it sounds kind of trite, but especially at the local level. And that's what I would make sure and encourage y'all to do, is get involved at that local level. Because if you have a mayor who's forward thinking on this and putting those contingency plans or think it's a big deal, those are the kind of people you need to be recruiting on your city councils, on your school boards. You need to make sure we're putting people in place where we have a vote and a say-so to put those people in place to focus on that. And then I know when I hear from constituents, it always rises the meter. As Abby was saying earlier, if nobody's talking to you about it, you're probably got 100 other things that you're thinking about. But if you'll just consistently stay on top of your elected officials saying, this is a huge deal, what are we doing about this? What can we do about it? What can be done next session? That goes a long way. And when your various representatives and senators continually hear from you on it, that helps them to know, okay, this is a real issue.
He touched on something that I totally see. And my job, I'm not supposed to think about people's motives because you don't know what's in someone's heart. But it has been just watching the change of power in administrations. It has struck me that oftentimes politicians screaming about the deficit is less about worrying about the deficit and more about stopping the agenda of the other side. And there's just, I'm very pessimistic about this looking forward. And I just there was two kind of formative political events that kind of stick in my mind over the last 10 years or so. And one, it was sort of a fun job, although it was sort of sad at the same time. But when in 2010, during the midterms, my job was to watch every political commercial I could find. And for John King on CNN. I sort of liked it. It's sort of a weird thing. But I would get really upset because there would be these, usually running for Senate or governor, members of the House, Republicans, saying, we gotta stop the deficit, this is bad. But then I'd go look at their voting record and they all, like almost every single one of them voted for Medicare Part D, which is the largest unfunded entitlement like ever. And so it was just like, oh my gosh, this is hypocrisy. And that's basically where the Tea Party came from, was saying, hey, you guys, you haven't been consistent. But then the other thing was attending a Bernie Sanders rally last year, and he has this room, he has them electrified, and he is promising single payer, he is promising free college. Never once does he really touch on how he's gonna pay for it. And that's where the Democratic Party's moving now. And so I wouldn't be surprised if single payer is like the issue that where presidential candidates in 2020 have to weigh in on, and they're super pressured to go that direction. And I don't know in the context of $21 trillion how you even fit in single payer. And so it's a hard, I don't see the bleeding stopping anytime soon until there are real consequences. And I would like to devote more time to it and to educating the public, but I'm also like chasing 1,000 things. I never know each day what I'm gonna write about. And so you don't get to the things that aren't setting people's hair on fire in the moment. So, but maybe I can do better.
I think two things. I think the most important thing is have a dialogue with people on terms that they can get their brain around on this. I mean, the biggest I think problem we face on these issues is just what people understand versus what they don't. You know, they really oftentimes don't understand how much federal funding, for example, impacts their life. And it's actually, in the world of post-sequestration, it's not that hard to go and find some examples to where you can then go to your neighbor and say, did you realize that when federal funding gets cut, your free and reduced price lunch might become twice as expensive? Or whatever it is. You know, there's things in transportation, there's things in welfare programs. There's any number of human examples of what this means for people, that if we can go find those and then go start a dialogue, start a conversation with people, get, whether it be like at your local fraternal organization, your local church, you don't have to be crazy about it and just annoy the heck out of everybody because you're the weird person who's always coming and talking about federal funding. But there's lots of opportunities in the world that we live in where politics is everywhere, the federal government in particular is everywhere in the news, to just have natural conversations about this that raise people's awareness, that maybe help them understand why they should care about this. And then as far as maybe some policies, one more policy solution I think that has been helpful in Utah is using the checks and balances approach of American governance. So we passed a law a handful of years ago that requires if a state agency or a school district, which is a political subdivision in Utah, wants to go get a federal grant above a certain dollar threshold, or that would require them to hire more employees, full-time employees, that they have to take that to their respective elected body. So in a state agency, they have to go to the state legislature. If it's a school district, they have to go to the state school board, which is an elected body in Utah. And they have to get approval for those things. Again, there's various thresholds where that triggers. But the point is it creates a blockage, I guess, if for lack of a better term, in the system where somebody can look at it and say, no, that's not going to be good because of this, this, and this. And they have to get approval. It's not just go and get the money because the money's there to take. And, you know, that kind of a check and balance kind of system, I think, is how we do things in America. And it works because then it forces people to start talking and start thinking and to justify why they want the money rather than just saying because it's there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I want to maybe ask some individual questions just predicated off y'all's unique sort of positions as a state lawmaker, as a reporter, as a policy analyst. And we'll start with you, Representative Krause. All this money we're talking about also comes with an insane amount of strings, right? When the federal government sends money to Texas, or if they're sending it to municipalities and bypassing us, it comes with mandates, it comes with requirements, and it basically says, here's how you have to spend the money, and here's what you have to spend the money on. Roughly 60%, if I'm recalling my figures correctly, the Texas budget is healthcare and education. How does the federal funds coming to you as a state lawmaker, how does that impact your ability to legislate, to do what's best for Texans when you have all this sort of federal interference in the noise of what you guys are trying to do at the state capitol?
Yeah, it can be very frustrating at times, and that's one reason a lot of us have pushed for block grants, especially for Medicaid coming down from the federal government. So that would be, they don't necessarily give you money for individual programs, tell you what to do, what not to do. They just say, here, Texas, here's your amount of money, and you can spend it any way you want to in the healthcare field. And I remember talking with TPPF when I first got into the legislature, and they showed how much better and much more efficient we could use our money. Again, that's our money, right? I mean, it's not money that we get. The only reason DC has it is because we give it to them. The only reason we have money in Austin is because the taxpayers, everybody in here, gives it to us. So I always do think it's funny, like on the whole tax debate, where it's saying, well, Washington doesn't get to keep as much of its money this way. Well, it wasn't their money to begin with. You know, I think it's just a fundamental flaw in the vision that the only way governments have money is because taxpayers give it to them. But so I would like to see us have a lot less strings attached. My district director, Scott Steers, back there, and we've been doing tours of a lot of our public schools, charter schools in the district, and it's amazing the strings attached to education. Sure. And so these teachers want to help out these kids maybe on a learning disability spectrum, but they're not so far over that they fall into one of the 17 categories the federal government has listed that a teacher can help them with. But this teacher wants to help them, and the specialist wants to help them, but they're prohibited from doing so just because they don't fall into this neat little category. And so you think about all the time, energy, effort wasted by following the rules, with compliance, instead of actually getting towards the goal of educating somebody or helping somebody feel better because of all the strings attached. So, and again, the more strings are attached, the less we can do autonomously, and Texans like to be autonomous. So I think we do need to move away as much as possible. Lord willing, you would think with the Republican administration, they would help us move towards that, and hopefully we'll get to see some of that next couple of years, but it's very frustrating at sometimes.
Yeah, there's a particular program, I don't know if y'all followed it, it's called the Children's Health Insurance Program, or it used to be called the State Children's Health Insurance Program, and that's important. And it was up for reauthorization in Washington, D.C., and there was big, Abby, you probably remember this, a lot of acrimony about, is it gonna get reauthorized? Why is it languishing? We're talking about kids' health insurance. And I remember I was talking with a reporter at another publication, and they asked me, they were like, well, what does TPPF recommend in this regard, right? And I said, well, Texas should run this program. Why do you have a bunch of Washington politicians in charge of health insurance? Seems like a pretty bad idea, right? And, you know, we have a quote, part-time legislature. You guys would have been able to address that particular program if you had control of it, probably delivering better care at lower cost to kids who needed it. And it's just an example of it. If Texas had control of this particular program, the kids in Texas would have been fine, no matter what was happening in Washington, D.C., right? And, I think that's a particular example from this past year where it was just very clear cut to me, even, coming from a limited government conservative perspective, where I was like, look, like, I may not think the government should be involved in health insurance, and I don't, but if it's going to be involved, then let's let Texas at least do what Texas does best and look after these kids.
Yeah, and it cuts down on the waste, fraud, and abuse
Right.
when you're doing it more locally. It's not going to be perfect. Texas isn't perfect, but I think it would be a little better than somebody so far removed from the process.
And it used to be kind of managed by the states for the most part, and that's unfortunately moved in the opposite direction. But Abby, I want to ask a different question to you. The Texas Tribune has got a good reputation for investigative reporting. You guys are really good at tracking things down, at breaking news, and at following sort of these sort of minutia. And there's so much that you deal with every day with the size and scope of Washington, D.C., and the noise that happens up there. From your perspective, how does this break through to you? How does this impact your everyday, reporting and job when you see just the mammoth size of Washington, D.C. and everything they're dealing in? What does that do for you?
So I've told this story several times, and I'll give y'all sort of a secret of reporting. When we know something's going to happen, we do what we call as a pre-write, and we'll write it beforehand, and then when it happens, like they're going to vote today on this spending thing, and I'll probably sit down and write what I think is going to happen, and then when it happens, I fill in the details and we publish it. I rarely do that now because there was a point last April during a recess, and it was a budget story. I don't remember it anymore, but I was really excited, and I did an interview with Jody Arrington, the congressman from Lubbock, who's on the budget committee, and I was really excited. And I did this interview before he left for recess, and on that Wednesday I sat down and wrote it. And then Thursday midday, and it was supposed to run on Monday when they got back. Thursday midday, the president tweeted something. Everything I wrote was out of date. Everything the congressman said was out of date. And I was just like, I wasted his time. I wasted my time. So I don't do that often. So it's sort of fun. It's sort of not, but you just kind of show up and see what happens. I now have an intern, and I'll tell them, like, I'm not going to tell you the night before what we're working on. I will tell you that morning where to go. And I know that's really weird. So it's a lot of reacting. I do have pet stories that I work on, but they usually take months to pull together, and it's something that I'll really care about. Like, I wrote a story about women running for office in Texas, and there's this long history of not electing a new freshman female congresswoman, but it took me months to get all the reporting together, whereas 2 years ago I probably could have written it in a week with concentration. But there's a really horrible side to it too. I play on the press team of a charity softball game against female members of Congress, and we practice before work. And I'm the pitcher, and I was throwing pitches, and all of a sudden our coach, Carl Hulse, yelled, "Practice is over." And I was like, what? I didn't get to bat. And I get to the dugout, and one of my colleagues looks at me seriously. Her face was serious, and she said, "Steve Scalise has been shot." And I was like, oh my God. And so we all got into our cars and drove out to suburban Virginia, and I am at a crime scene in baseball cleats. And that is the saddest commentary of modern politics, that I can't even go to a softball practice. And I mean, the thing was, that was a miracle. It was not worse. It could have been 10 times worse for many reasons. Reason it was not mostly was because of the officers on the scene. But so sometimes the excitement's sort of fun, and sometimes I just walk around and walk home, and I'm like, I can't believe this just happened. And so it's a lot to take in, and so it's been a wild ride for the last year and a half or so.
And Derek, I guess from you, on this particular subject and with regard to how we address this, how we address with local and federal debt, what can Texans learn from you guys out in Utah?
Well, actually I think it'll come back to the power of creating a dialogue that creates awareness. And maybe just to drive that home a little bit, to think about something maybe a little bigger than this issue. The founding of our country, right? That happened because there was a bunch of people who maybe otherwise wouldn't be very politically inclined, who were having conversations about politics and policy and all the things that a foreign ruler, they wasn't foreign at the time, obviously, and they were having those conversations in bars, at their homes, over dinner tables, with their neighbors. And because all of that was happening, when the moment came that that some action could actually be taken, right? When the British March on Concord, right? When the Boston Tea Party happens. Because of all of that conversation and dialogue that happened, when those things then the moment is here to take an action, now there's action that could be taken. And I think secondly, I would say that politicians, elected officials, I know there are a lot of you in the room, tend to be lagging indicators, right, of where we are as a society. They follow their constituents, not the other way around. Again, as an example, going back to the founding, the Declaration of Independence was enacted long after the people of the colonies had officially declared independence, right, and were at war with Great Britain. They were ready for that, but it took the politicians a while to come around to that. And so I think the lessons we can learn there are, if we start having these conversations, raising awareness on these issues, thinking through the policy solutions that are available and getting together with the coalitions that need to be put together, there's going to come a moment when something's going to happen where action can become possible. You know, maybe sequestration 2.0, maybe a federal default, or the debt ceiling, or a huge increase in the debt ceiling that causes outrage across the country. And if we've done all that groundwork, then I think we'll be able to make progress. If we haven't, then we'll probably be scrambling, and we'll get sucked up into the politics of division, and people don't want their oxes gored, and if they're in the federal bureaucracy, for example. And it's going to be hard to actually push things forward because we weren't ready when the moment came. And so again, it comes back to this dialogue thing, and it probably sounds naive or whatever, but it's America. That's how we've gotten things done, whether it be civil rights, again, the founding of the country, you name the issue. It started because of conversations that happened between normal people in their own everyday lives.
Something just to tie that together, Abby, I remember my phone was blowing up from my friends who were at the field, staffers who had left, and when that day happened, it was awful. And it's a scary thing to see, right, when you see members of Congress that this happens. And Derek, to tie into your point, one of the things that we advocate for passionately at the Texas Public Policy Foundation is federalism, because, in the words of former Governor Rick Perry, we want to make Washington as inconsequential in your lives as possible. Mm-hmm. And it seems today, that was an example of one side, right? But we've seen it on the other side as well. It's the sort of where this vitriol and visceral, hatred of the other side leads to something terrible like that happening. It's happened on both sides. And this is why, I think the federalism approach is a potential remedy to this. A potential remedy to, if California wants to be California, so be it. I don't agree with single payer from a policy perspective or from a freedom perspective, but if they want to experiment with it, fine, just don't let us be on the hook for it. Mm-hmm. And if Texas wants healthcare freedom, then by God, let us have control over our health insurance markets, and we'll regulate it as much as we want or as less as we want. And so, to this end, with regard to tracking these funds, from a state perspective, how do y'all think, given the current climate, that we promote federalism as a solution and reinvigorate that conversation of, progressive states can be progressive, conservative states can be conservative, and we're still united under one banner as Americans?
Yeah, well, I agree. I think part of the vitriol, the partisanship, the hyperbole is all because Washington has become way too important in our lives, right? That we wait every June for 9 justices to tell us what the Constitution means or says or how they interpret it. They were never supposed to have that much power over public policy or what we do. And then every decision out of Washington, D.C. now, because they've infiltrated so much of our lives, makes everything such high stakes. And so I think you're right. I think if we could get back to where Washington wasn't as consequential in your life as possible, or as it used to be, then things would settle down a little bit. And how you do that, I don't know. I think it's got to be, I have enjoyed seeing Democrat states now understand the benefits of federalism in the last year or so, now saying, hey, don't do to us what Trump wants to do. And so I think that's great. I think that's helping foster the dialogue, actually. And I hope that Republicans or Republican-led states won't just show it as a partisan thing, but a principled thing, and we'll dialogue together and say, yeah, a runaway DC or executive is not good for anybody, no matter which side you're on. And so I think that discussion's starting to happen. And I don't know, but I agree with you. The states need to be the laboratories of experiment, and not, it doesn't put everything on everybody and mess everybody up if the experiment's wrong. If it's good, then I think Right on Crime is a great example of what TPPF has done. We started in Texas. We've done a lot of good things on criminal justice reform. Other states picked up on it. They thought it was really good. Now more states are picking up on it. Now the federal government's kind of looking at, okay, is this a good model overall? But that's because one state was able to figure out what they wanted to do and pursue it, and it's working out well for everybody. If it had been an abysmal failure, then Texas would have been harmed, but nobody else would have. And that's the key point I think you can get to other states and other people, and I think maybe that's what they get.
I can hear Brooke Rollins' amen somewhere out there.
Yeah. I'm not going to endorse one view of the role of government or another, just in my role as a journalist, but there is a rule and a law I sort of try to abide by, and it's the golden rule. And I am worried. I mean, I felt the baseball shooting coming. I didn't know what was going to happen, but a couple days before, I turned to a friend right outside the chamber of the Senate and said, something's in the air. Something's going to happen, and it's not going to be good. And I just hope folks hold their leaders, whether they're media leaders or politicians, to a high standard of treating other people with respect. And, you know, it's how I try to do my work. And it is I mean, Twitter is a wild place, and you know, I've got pretty thick skin now, but there's a lot of stuff going around that's not healthy in this society, and I think we should call each other out when we go a little too far sometimes.
I think one thing we can do is start having conversations with people who don't think the way we do about these kinds of things, and ideally in terms that they care about, as opposed to the terms that we care about, which may not mean much to them. So I mean, a great example, right, is what some states, blue or left of center states, have responded to what Trump wants to do on whatever it is, immigration or taxes or whatever. And what you come to find out, I think, when you start having those conversations, is we actually agree on like a whole lot of stuff. You know, so again, in this context, we actually agree that whether people are being rounded up in our communities shouldn't depend on who's sitting in the Oval Office, right? As an example. And so that's federalism, right? But it's not under the term federalism because most people don't really understand what that means, and it's certainly not something that resonates with them. But they do resonate with things like equality, or with limited government, or with low taxes, or whatever it may be. And when you start having those conversations, all of a sudden all of this controversial politics and divisiveness goes out the window, because again, you come to find out that you just agree on so much. And now you can actually start to take action because of that, and kind of reject all of the politics of division that say, you know, we're too divided to solve things, which is just actually, well, I won't go into that because you put up the 2-minute sign a second ago. So, but all of that can be resolved, I think, when we start talk to each other rather than at each other.
Yeah. May I chime in one point that kind of builds on this? I wrote a profile last year on Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, and she is a very interesting character, and but she is one of the most criticized members of the Texas delegation. And over the years, I sort of just noticed that quietly she has all these friends in Congress who would surprise you. And if she ever got into political trouble, she would have so much cover. People from all over the country would race in to help her. But one of the quotes in my story was a local radio host who some of y'all may know, Ed Hindy. He's a close family friend of mine, and that was sort of the genesis of the story. And he said, Sheila and I cannot agree on what day of the week it is. But I think the Hindys gave her one of her first checks in her run for Congress because they admired her work in the city council. And the one thing they have in common is they all love the city of Houston. And that's what that's one of the stories I've most enjoyed writing, is just like that they believe she would be a better congresswoman than the man who was in there beforehand, even though they didn't agree with her. And sometimes it's like stories like that are kind of what keeps me going amid all of this. So.
Yeah. Well, I think what we'll do now, is I'd like to open this up to Q&A with regard to anything that's on your minds in terms of, federal intervention, the amount of money that's being spent, what this is doing to the discourse and the dialogue, and what we can do in Texas and how that impacts us. I want to open that up. Just a couple of rules real quick before we do. Wait till the mic gets to you and make sure that you ask a question. That would be awesome. So I guess we'll start with you first, sir. I saw your hand, and then we'll go down the line.
A number of years ago, I was on a federal policy staff for several years, and simultaneously, for several years, I was a local city councilman. And one of my disturbing things with me on the federal policy staff was the reward for that kind of service was the greatest when you created another entitlement, funded or unfunded. I thought, well, wait a minute now. Federal government is getting greater and greater in debt. States and locals have a ceiling on that. Shouldn't the state and locals be giving money to the federal government? It just, my big hair began to get on fire. And then in my city council responsibility, the Municipal League and the National League of Cities and all of that, they wanted more federal grants, funded or unfunded. And my hair really got on fire, and that's why I'm bald today. Yeah. But my question is, you need to approach this in several directions simultaneously. One of the Supreme Court of the United States. I understand that in the debate on the 10th Amendment, there was some that said that it was unnecessary. It's just redundant. The whole Constitution is written to say that this is all the federal government can do. Well, I don't think that has been carried out by our Supreme Court. We may have justices now, or with one more appointment, that would reverse a whole lot of that, solve a whole lot of this problem, including the massive debt that's going to kill us. Starting with the Supreme Court. And that's my question. Why can't the Supreme Court rein this in under the rule that the federal government can't do any more than what it says it's supposed to do in the Constitution?
Turn that to the constitutional lawyer.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, I think it kind of goes back to what Derek was saying earlier on checks and balances. I don't know if you know, but in the Constitution, it actually says that Congress can limit the jurisdiction of the courts and what they can hear. And so if you don't want the court taking up any more pro-life cases, you can tell them that. If you don't want them taking up flag-burning cases, you can tell them that. And so I think, honestly, I think a lot of times the federal Congress likes being able to punt to the judiciary and say, hey, here's what we think, here's what we don't think, you tell us what we're going to do. So until you have a Congress who kind of stands up and says, we're not going to increase the debt anymore, we don't want the 9 justices solving all of our problems for us, if they'll start doing some of those things, then it would make us a lot better off.
It could be done by Convention of States.
And it could be done by a Convention of States, which
Something
was also
we're
in
also
the
working on.
Constitution. Yeah.
Yes, very active in Article 5 efforts.
That's
I
right.
could chime in too. I think a lot of it comes down to our political culture, whether we simply defer to what judges tell us or not. I'm not talking civil disobedience. What I'm talking about is, for instance, what Abraham Lincoln did when the Dred Scott case came down, right? He didn't simply accept that and say, hey, the court's ruled, I can't do anything, move on. He said the court has ruled, and in this case, this particular set of facts case, that's what the decision is. And then he went all throughout the country saying why that case was wrong and why we need to change that court decision either through legislation or through other means. And I think a lot of times now there's almost this, like I say, it's almost like a reverential deference sometimes to what the court says. And sometimes it may be politically motivated, right, that we like the decision, so we're just going to say, hey, the court's ruled, we're done. But that bleeds into other, I think, conversations when our leaders say those kinds of things. And so I think, again, having the right understanding of how to talk about these things in a way that doesn't undermine our court system because, you know, they frankly rely on people just going with what they say when we want a judiciary that works. So that's a good thing. But then having these dialogues and debates about whether that decision was right or wrong, and I think that's how you eventually get things overturned, right? When the culture says, no, that was wrong, and the courts, again, they're kind of a lagging indicator as well. They follow along.
I saw your hand second. Yes.
Okay, so I have a household full of millennials. And it's required at our house, because I homeschool, they don't get to graduate without taking Dave Ramsey's personal finance course. That's
Nice.
required for my kids, right? And so even with this upbringing, my kids have bought into the fact that they're never going to be able to buy a car cash. They've already saved for 3 years and still can't buy a car cash. They don't make enough. The wages just aren't there when you're a starving student, right? So the mentality that we've trained these kids through just lots of bad decision making is that debt is a way of life. And they don't see it as a danger like our generation and other generations have seen it. So my question is, how can we reframe the debate? Because obviously, I'm doing it at home, trying to do my best, right? Like as a journalist, Abby, like, since everybody doesn't read anymore, you have to do it in graphics, apparently, your inset graphics on your story, but, you know, giving them some kind of perspective. I mean, we all tell them abuse of alcohol and drugs is bad and it's gonna harm you, but we're not getting that message through to this generation about what this debt's gonna do to them down the road. And I know that when you were talking about the policy side, you know, at some point it's all gonna come crumbling down and we're gonna have to face it. How can we be more proactive, I guess, on all levels of what you all represent there on the panel, of how we can kind of dial this back with the millennials that have been conditioned to think that debt is just a way of life and that there's no big deal?
Good question.
I mean, I guess it's hard, and it's. I mean, I don't know if I'm a millennial or not. I'm sort of in the gap between that age and Gen X, and so. But my age group, my friends who went to law school graduated in '09 basically, and they entered right during the crash. And so, you know, I see it, and we were expecting a very different outlook in our, you know, college education, and it was all a shock. I don't know. I think so much of it is at home. I mean, all I can say is, I mean, I grew up in a home, and my dad drove a 1984 station wagon into the new millennium, and it was humiliating in high school. But my parents are very secure, much more than their friends in their retirement, and they're able to do things. And so, I don't know. There's clearly journalism that can be done, but I also just wish a lot of people were a lot more like my parents and taught their children by example. And it's a hard issue, and it's, I held off on a credit card for a very long time because they scared me. And so, I at UT, they would offer. I saw one of my classmates carrying a pizza around. I'm like, why are you carrying a pizza between classes? And he said they gave me a free one for signing up for a credit card. And it was just like, what? So, there's probably some bigger policy things I haven't thought through, but you are doing the right thing by teaching your children financial literacy, and I think that's great.
Yeah, I think there's a reason at a lot of churches they have Dave Ramsey's course, and it's called Financial Peace. You know,
Love Dave Ramsey.
Yeah, he's fantastic, and so there's a reason it's peace. You know, because when you have your finances in order, you live life a lot less stressful. And so I would encourage your children to talk to people maybe 10 years older than them who have lived on that method. Most of the ones I've talked to who don't live with any kind of sense of budget or ability to handle debt are stressed out every month. They don't know how they're going to pay this unless they pay it off with this credit card, but now they've got a bigger interest rate on this credit card, so they've got to transfer the balance over to this credit card, but they know they're going to get this bonus. So I think just hearing the real life experiences of people who continue on that stage of debt helps out a lot. And then, as Abby said, I don't think anything replaces good leadership at home and a good example. We have horrible examples in Washington, D.C., and a lot of states. Probably Texas does some of that too, but parents in the home, I think, is really where it's going to help.
Yeah, I think too, particularly with the millennials. So I'm kind of like you, kind of that borderline, whether I'm a millennial or not. I'm usually when I say that though, millennials will say you're not a millennial.
Yeah, that's right.
If that's what you're saying, you're not a millennial.
That's right.
Okay, well, Fair enough. But I was born in '82, right? So that's kind of that borderline. And one thing I think to understand with the younger generations is to understand their mindset, right? So one thing that I've observed is the millennial generation thinks they can solve anything, right? And I'm not saying they're being like arrogant. I'm just saying they're go-getters, right? They want to go out and solve things. They want to go out and do big things. And so I think if you challenge younger generations, and you see this, for example, in various groups that millennial folks are forming. In Utah, for instance, there's this, it's called like Millennial X or something, I can't remember what the name of it, but it's just a bunch of millennials who really aren't that political, but they see all these problems going on, and they decided they're going to get together and start talking about them and inviting politicians to come and try to solve some things. So I guess maybe what I'm saying is look for those kinds of opportunities to challenge the younger generations on this issue of debt, on federalism. Of course, again, you got to put it in terms that they can get their brain around, right? This is going to affect your college education. It's going to affect your ability to get a job. It's going to affect this and this and this. But I think when you put it in those terms to them, they are more than willing to take it and run with it because that's what millennials want to do, I think.
Yeah, I think you're doing a great job, honestly. You're doing your job at home. And I'll just say, my wife jokes all the time. I'm 32. She's like, you're 32 going on 83 because you keep screaming, get off my lawn. Yeah. And it's like, I guess I'm sort of in that border region as a millennial as well, or not a millennial. I don't really know, but I think that's great advice all around. I think we had a question here and then in the back after that.
Yes, I'd like to ask a question about transparency. And the specific example I'm going to use is the Department of Health and Human Services, Texas Department of Health and Human Services. I would love to see a flow chart created that you could easily access on their website to show all of the various committees, commissions, departments, subdivisions of that, and then how their entire process of decision-making works in their whole system. So for me, as somebody who might want to be able to speak to a specific policy issue, would know where to go in that whole system, because I think it's a labyrinth, and also to be able to go and talk to my state rep, my state senator, and say, okay, here, here, and here are places that I think improvements could be made. And because it takes a heck of a long time to learn about all this stuff, to know where to begin and who to begin to address things with.
Yeah, I think a flow chart would be great. Our office has worked a lot on this fragile kids. It's this population of kids in Texas that one of these kids is one of only 8 people in all the United States with this certain particular malady. And so we've been working a lot with HHSC trying to find that. And you're right, sometimes it can be difficult to drill down exactly who you need to talk to. And that's coming from a legislative office. So I think that point is very well taken. And I would tell you we'll do it, but I don't want to lie to you. So I want to under-promise and over-deliver, but we'll definitely take a look into that. Maybe there is something there, but you're right. I think transparency is always good, and anytime you can know where to go with your complaint to your elected officials, I think it gives you a lot of confidence in the system.
Yeah, I'd just add to that. One of the components of what we're proposing for this initiative, funds that are sort of circumventing the state legislature and going directly to these subdivisions, we're proposing put it in escrow and then have lawmakers look at it, whether it's reported to a committee, to a state agency, put it in escrow. And then if that's inconsistent, right, with the Texas Constitution, with the U.S. Constitution, then they can't spend the money. You circumvented the state. The states are sovereign, according to the 10th Amendment. And that's an idea that it's percolated. Dr. Lindsay has proposed this. I think it's a brilliant idea. But to your point, adding sort of a component of who do we talk to in all this? Who's receiving all these funds? Where do we go? We've spoken with other states. Indiana has this problem as well. They have no idea where a lot of this money's going and who to talk to. We talk with their policy analysts, and they're like, great question. And so, and that's part of the problem, right? I mean, that is the problem. That just shows you how much money is being spent, how many entities are out there taking that money through, through the conduits and dispersing it. And it can be staggering, but I think that's a great suggestion. And you had a question, sir, and then there was one in the back as well. I think that we have time for two more.
There was so much discussion about transparency today. I'm in the healthcare industry, outcomes and stuff like that. But the situation with respect to, in fact, first question real quick. Early in the discussion, you said that the local debt was a certain figure. And then you made a comment after that, how much it dropped in like a 4 or 5 year period. What caused that?
Great question.
Transparency.
Transparency is needed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now here's what I was thinking. If transparency is important and people need to be informed, and maybe this is something Texas public policy could do. If we showed each city, county, and so on, we publish what their debt is and what the consequences would be if there's drawback from the state, drawback from the feds, and so on, and develop a benchmark, so to speak. What is that? What is, in corporate, when we look at stocks and this and that, and when you borrow for a home and this and that, it's how much debt can you tolerate? What's a reasonable amount? What if Texas public policy published all this debt information, set a benchmark? It's not written in stone, but it can be adjusted. And so you let the people know where you stand with respect to the benchmark and to other municipalities, counties, and so on. It just, in Corpus Christi, where I'm from, it just amazes me. We never turn down a bond election. Everything passes, especially the school stuff. And I don't understand that. I'm just throwing that out as an idea to make the public more informed. Maybe they wouldn't push passing so many bond elections if they were if they knew they were teetering on potential insolvency.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a very interesting idea. I've got a few comments on it. First, we probably need to start working on Saturdays if we're going to do that, which is fine. And then James is going to need about 10 more people in his shop as well. Yeah, sorry, I'm looking at you. That's right. So that's a good idea. I mean, we need to know. I think this is our mentality on this is, we're taking an all of the above approach on this to try to figure out what's the best way to ensure that municipalities are not circumventing the state legislature, that state lawmakers like Representative Krause have a good idea how much money is out there that he may have to deal with if the feds continue on their current course, and then the policy proposals to curb that back to help Texans so that whatever impact happens when that debt bubble bursts, it's minimized for all of us in this room, for all of our kids and for all of our grandkids. And I think, if it's something like that, I think that's something we definitely look at. Legislatively, I think we're going to look at the escrow approach to see if that's a good first start. But obviously, that's just a first start. There's so many things we can and probably should do going forward. And unfortunately, I just found out we have run out of time. We could probably talk about all these things for hours and hours and hours, but Lieutenant Governor is about to speak. I want to make sure I release you guys to that. But I want to thank y'all for coming in. Thank you for the questions. I want to thank our panelists. Please give them a round of applause.